Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. U.S. trade with China, Canada, and Mexico could look very different in the coming weeks and months, depending on what happens with President Trump's tariffs. This week, a 10% tariff was levied against China, and proposals for 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico have been briefly put on hold, but could potentially take effect in March. Joining us to break down this situation is Monica Gorman. She is a managing director at Crowell Global Advisors. She was a special assistant at the White House, where she was the chair of the White House Supply Chain Disruptions Task Force. Monica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you have a lot of experience in this particular area when it comes to supply chains and U.S. trade. Can you just zoom out with us for a second and tell us where we are with U.S. trade and tariffs at this point in February 2025?
Sure, and it's certainly been a whirlwind few weeks. So starting with that framing. Why don't we take a step back and just think about some of the key things that have happened in the last couple of weeks. So starting on the president's first day, he signed the America First Trade Policy Executive Order, and that mandates several cabinet agencies to do a review of key national and economic security priorities. Those reviews will be due in April of this year. So that is one area that we'll want to continue to watch that is likely to lay out key priorities for the administration. I believe it was the day after the president signaled that he would potentially impose tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China. And then certainly fast forward to this past weekend on Saturday, the February 1st, we saw those executive orders signed, 25% tariffs on Mexico, on Canada, and 10% on China. Again, a flurry of activity in the last few days. Talks were clearly ongoing with the Mexican and Canadian authorities, and a temporary agreement was reached. The president agreed to pause those tariffs for 30 days while those discussions continue, as the Canadians and the Mexicans made commitments to additional border security measures. So at this point, we are in a holding pattern on the Canadian and Mexican tariffs. The tariffs on Chinese imports, however, did go into effect on Tuesday of this week. So a lot has happened, and we are already in a different situation now that we do have 10% tariffs on Chinese imports as of Tuesday.
And then Beijing has announced retaliation tariffs. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I should note, too, both Canada and Mexico signaled that they would also impose retaliatory tariffs if those measures had gone into effect. So we know that those are on the table potentially in the future.
So there are potentially massive economic implications here. Let's start with China, because that's what actually went into effect this week. What is the cost to U.S. businesses and/or consumers from these tariffs?
So that's going to vary quite significantly depending on industry. Certain industries are more dependent on Chinese imports than others. One thing I do want to note that was included in the executive order on China is a change to the de minimis policy. So de minimis packages are less than $800 in value. They tend to be small packages. And historically, de minimis packages have been able to come into the U.S. with far less information, data as to what is contained. They don't pay the typical import duties that would be imposed on those products. And then they also don't pay the Section 301, Section 201, Section 232, other types of punitive tariffs that might be imposed on those products. That exception has now been eliminated on products coming from China. So in addition to all of the other products, there's that 10% tariff, as well as all these other duties now on those small packages. The reason I raise it is there are some significant, we've seen significant growth in de minimis. I believe there's over 1 billion packages now a year. And e-commerce platforms, e-commerce retailers, as well as small businesses tend to rely more on the de minimis exception. So that is an area where we could start to see fairly quickly some impacts to pricing of goods that Americans are buying every day.
There have been different estimates that I've seen. I think the Yale School of Management put out a $1,000 per household per year estimate over the weekend, and I think that was more in reference to the Canadian and Mexican tariffs. I saw the Tax Policy Institute, same range, $800 per household per year. Can you talk about, Monica, both the the American tariffs on China and the retaliation tariffs? What products and services and goods specifically will those affect?
So most immediately, I would say apparel, footwear, consumer products coming from China, because those are largely the products that are coming in through the de minimis exception. That is likely to see the most significant increase. I want to caveat that by saying it will be up to the retailers, particularly those e-commerce platforms, as to how those costs are passed along to American consumers. And I can speak from my own experience, having worked on trade policy in the White House. It really depends on how much of those costs are passed along. And that will be up to the companies to determine, is it 100% pass through of those duties, or will the company absorb some of those costs so as not to ask consumers to pay more? But that's an area where I think we will see some immediate impacts. For others, if you're talking materials or components or elements that go into other products, that may be more of a delayed impact. Likely that would also be passed through eventually to the final consumer or the final customer, but that may take longer. It really depends on what is being imported and then the overall pricing of the product. And then the company's decision, whoever is selling that product, are they going to eat some of that cost, or do they need to pass that all the way on to the end customer?
Now, President Trump had campaigned on lowering prices for Americans. So is this a situation where the administration could put pressure on companies to eat the cost of the tariff so it doesn't get passed on to consumers? Is that at all in the realm of possibility here?
I don't know that I want to speculate on what the administration is going to do. Certainly, Americans were clear when they voted that they did want to see prices, they want to see prices come down. So that is certainly going to be, I think, a key area of concern for the administration. But companies have their own incentive not to pass along all of these costs. So companies, I think, will be doing the best they can not to just wholesale ask Americans to pay more. But at some point, a company can't eat all that cost. And again, this is where it will really come down to what is the type of product. If it is a very low margin product where there isn't much profitability, there's going to be less room for a company to actually eat that cost. If it is a higher margin product, the company may choose to actually take on some of that so as not to lose their consumers. Because if Americans cut back on spending, then they have fewer products being bought.
Now, moving to Canada and Mexico, those tariffs were delayed by 30 days with potentially further delays. And I know you don't want to speculate, but from your expert experience, how many times could this get delayed? Or what do we know? If I'm a consumer worried about my avocados, what should I be doing right now?
Well, you can't stock up on avocados because they don't last that long. So I think we want to remain hopeful that those discussions will continue to be constructive and that will not ultimately come to tariffs. Tariffs on Mexico and Canada will be significantly disruptive. Given the history of first NAFTA and then the USMCA, supply chains across North America are highly integrated, particularly in certain industries. So think the auto industry. Pieces of a car go back and forth across both borders many times, and there can be a factory in the United States that is dependent on the engines coming from Canada, and the factory in the US will go idle if those engines aren't coming in from Canada. If they are coming in but are more expensive, that is going to make the car more expensive. So for the auto industry, it's significant. For agriculture, as you mentioned, it's very significant. For oil, it's very significant. Refineries are set up with certain pipelines, and you can't just reconfigure those pipelines to get oil from somewhere else. It takes a while. So I think the hope here is that those diplomatic discussions will continue to be constructive and that all parties are working to try to reach agreement so that we don't have to face a scenario where those tariffs go into effect.
In your experience, are tariffs an effective diplomatic tool and supply chain disruptions? Does that actually change relationships between countries and trade agreements between countries?
Tariffs are an important strategic tool, but ideally tariffs are used like a scalpel, not like a hammer. Tariffs can be very important to protect nation industries that a country wants to see grow. Tariffs may be important to address poor trade practices or unfair trade practices. And I would note that a lot of the trade remedies that we have are often after the fact, and the harm has already been done. And we've seen a lot of what happens when the harm is already done. It's hard to correct. So tariffs may be a valuable tool to try to get at some of those unfair trade practices in a more timely way. But again, our economy is so diverse, it's so vast, industries are different, supply chains are so different that across the board tariffs on everything is going to have a lot of unintended consequences.
You mentioned the review in April, and I'm wondering, if I'm a small business, do I do extra planning and preparation? Because we don't know what will happen in April, but we do have a little bit of a cushion there. Can you talk about what we can expect or reasonably expect over the next 2 months?
So over the next 2 months, a lot of work will be happening within the federal government. And again, I'll speak from my experience having done this in the White House in the past and also within the Commerce Department. There will be a great deal of work happening right now to study and research and answer the questions that the president has posed in the executive order. Those reports will be very important to read when they come out. That is likely to then signal in more depth and detail where the administration may go based on what has come from those reviews. So again, I think all eyes will be on those reviews in April. Certainly, if there are engagement opportunities, if there is outreach from those who are working on those reviews, that would be an opportunity to make one's voice heard if they are bringing in stakeholders. I don't exactly know how it's going to work in this administration, but again, the work that they are doing right now, I think will be very important signaling once we do get those reports in April.
President Trump used tariffs as a tool in his first term as president. Is there anything we can learn from that first term and apply it to this current situation?
It will be interesting to see if the processes used in the first term ultimately are also used again in this term. I think it's still too early to tell at this point. The approach so far has been a bit different, but that doesn't mean it's always going to be different. In the first term, there were opportunities for testimony from stakeholders and companies, others, in terms of how the tariffs would affect them before the tariffs ultimately went into effect. There was a notification period, so the tariffs didn't go into effect immediately. So that provides opportunity for businesses and companies to potentially adapt and take measures to address what is coming, or to make sure that their businesses are ready for what is coming. We've not seen that yet, but that does not mean that those processes might not be used. And so I think that's going to be a very interesting process to watch as we move forward in now the Trump 47 to see what will he actually employ similar processes this time.
If there are further delays in the imposition of these tariffs, will other countries see it and say, American President Trump is bluffing, don't listen to him, and then it stops becoming an effective tool?
That's a great question. It's certainly possible. What I would say, though, is trade is a system, and there are many actors in the system, especially when you're talking global trade. And the U.S. is a critical actor, but it's not the only actor. And when we are having these discussions with countries, there's certain actions, there's an action and a potential reaction. However, our trading partners have their own discussions with other countries as well. And so if there's a lot of uncertainty about the US posture, I wouldn't be surprised to see other countries saying, okay, we're not quite sure what the US is going to do. However, we need to strengthen our own trading relationships with our own like-minded partners. And so we may see more arrangements such as the agreement that the EU has now signed with Latin American countries in terms of trading within that regime. I would also expect China to assert its dominance in different parts of the world and strengthen its trading regimes with those partners. So there's a question in terms of the action-reaction with the US and our bilateral trading partners. But again, we can't discount what is going to happen in the rest of the world and what our trading partners are going to do with others and how that may in turn affect the US economy.
It is a complicated and interlocking situation, multifaceted. That is probably the best word. And Monica, thank you so much for coming on and breaking down what we know right now. We'll have to have you back as the situation continues to evolve.
I'd welcome the opportunity. It's been great talking about it. Thank you.